In the previous video, we looked at examples of sentences that were put together improperly. Either there was no punctuation at all and that made it a run-on, or we at least tried to add a comma, but that was a comma splice. You can't just connect two sentences with a comma, and here are just two examples, right? Here was our run-on, and here's our comma splice. And we said there that what you have to do is make sure they're properly coordinated. And by coordinated, it's a fancy word for basically saying you got to connect sentences, complete sentences, in particular ways. And in the next set of videos, starting with this one, we're going to talk about the ways you can do that. And the first basic way to do that is to use a comma, but also to use what's called a coordinating conjunction. And we're going to go through all of the coordinating conjunctions in a second that you can use, but you know quite a few of them. And is a coordinating conjunction, but is a coordinating conjunction, or, nor, so. So all these words can be used to connect two complete sentences with a comma. So in the first case, I walk, I run, if we add a comma and then let's say an end, that would work fine. I walk, comma, and I run. You could, for the next one, also add an end right here. I walk, and then I run. Which coordinating conjunction you use, as we'll talk about in a second, depends on the logic of the sentence. You also, for the first one, could have done I walk, comma, or I run. I mean, it's the same. I mean, it's not the same, but grammatically speaking, structurally, it's the same. The meaning is different, but the point is you have to have that comma and that conjunction. He visited the aquarium, stole a seal. There's actually kind of two ways to look at this one. One is to add that comma and then conjunction. So he visited the aquarium, comma, and he stole a seal. That would be fine. Notice when we add the comma and the conjunction, we then have to make sure that we have a complete sentence. So we can't, for example, do he visited the aquarium, comma, and stole a seal. Because if we did that, if we just wanted to add an end, which is actually legal, we don't need the comma at all. And this is what's called, fancy word incoming, fancy phrase, a compound predicate. Basically, you have two actions that he is doing. He visited the aquarium and stole a seal. It's really just one sentence. If you wanted to make it two separate sentences for whatever reason, you could do that. But then you'd have to add your comma, you'd add your conjunction end, and then you'd have to write a subject. So something like that. So you will never have to choose between these two corrections on the test because they're basically the same, but just two different ways of looking at it. Wednesday is the day that my team is most productive. We end up finishing more than we accomplish on the other 4 days of the week. So we would need to coordinate these properly. This is a run-on, as we saw previously. So we can add a comma here, and then the conjunction I would use in this case, if we wanted to use a coordinating conjunction, would be for. For, as we'll see, is one of our coordinating conjunctions. It basically means like because. Wednesday is the day that my team is most productive, for we end up finishing more than we accomplish on the other 4 days. Notice again, comma and a conjunction. The Yankees played my high school baseball team, comma, we won. We've got a comma splice here. What we need to do is add a conjunction here. So let's see, what would be, how about end? I mean, end is fine. Others potentially could work, but end we won is totally fine. One group thought that the scientists were correct. Another group thought they were wrong. This one, I guess we could use end, but I probably would prefer to use but. But shows contrast, right? So sometimes you have to use something like but instead of end to emphasize that contrast. Other times you'd want to use end instead of but if there is no contrast between those two sentences. Other times it depends. You can use either. In this case, because these two sentences are opposed to one another, they're showing opposite ideas, we would want to use but to connect them. So let's formally define coordination and go through the example conjunctions that you can use. So coordination is when you're connecting two or more complete independent sentences using a comma and a Fanboys conjunction. So Fanboys is an acronym that we can use to remind us of what the 7 proper coordinating conjunctions are. And I guess I'll write them out over here. So here is Fanboys. and they stand for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Some of these conjunctions are used more often than others, like and but. Ones like for or nor or yet are a little bit more, quite a bit rarer, but all of them technically are legal. So let's look at some example sentences that use these. I shook his hand, for he was a jolly good fellow. Remember, for essentially here operates like because. So you could write this as I shook his hand because he was a jolly good fellow. Sure, no problem with that. We also could do comma and the conjunction for to connect them, no problem. We saw this one previously. I walk and I run. Don Draper doesn't treat women well, nor does he treat himself well. So here we're using nor you're typically going to use when you are when you have two sentences that are basically saying the same idea and they're both negations, right? In this case, we have does not, which is kind of a negation. It's a negative thing. And then nor does he do this. Again, you're not really going to see that very often, but it's one of the fanboys. I wanted to go to the moon, but I failed my rocket driving test. So again, we've got some contrast, so we would want to use but. Using and here, for example, even though grammatically, structurally, it's okay, doesn't really work because we want to emphasize the contrast, right? I wanted to go to the moon and I failed my rocket driving test. I mean, I guess in some contexts that might work, but most of the time we would prefer but because it shows like I wanted to do this, but this thing happened that kind of prevented me from doing it. I will go to France or I will go to Delaware. So again, we've got two complete sentences separated with a comma and or in this case. Maria expected to enjoy the movie, yet she found it dull and uninspiring. So just like but, yet shows contrast. So I wouldn't say that they're interchangeable, but for our purposes, they basically are. You would never have to choose between but and yet because they're super close, but perfectly fine way of connecting these. John forgot which wire to cut, so he cut all of them. So here we have this comma and the conjunction, in this case so, and so shows essentially cause and effect. Kind of like because in some ways, though because would I guess have it the other way around. In any event, it shows cause and effect, it shows sequence of events, right? John forgot which wire to cut, so he cut all of them. So as we said, coordination is combining two or more independent clauses into one sentence, often using a comma and a fanboys coordinating conjunction. But as we're going to see, there are other ways to connect sentences. There are other ways to coordinate sentences, and there frankly are other ways to just connect them in other ways outside of coordination. And we're going to run through all those so you have all the tools in your toolbox to know how to handle them. Let's finish up by looking at some of the questions from the previous video on run-ons and comma splices that we haven't corrected yet. Now that we have coordination, we know how to use fanboys, we should be able to answer these with no problem. So Yogi Berra is nothing like Yogi Bear. He doesn't like picnic baskets. So we would need maybe something like for here to show that because type of relationship. And we would add that in after the comma and we'd be good. First, I will buy a Lamborghini. Second, I will buy a bucket of white paint. Finally, I will splash the leather interior of the Lambo with white paint. So here, I might not use coordinating conjunctions in the typical case. I might actually use, as we'll see in, I think, the next video, semicolons. But let's say we wanted to. What would I do? Again, it's kind of awkward to do it that way. I suppose we would just use and. First, I will buy a Lamborghini, and second, I will buy a bucket of white paint, and finally, I will splash blah, blah. So that would be, I guess, an okay way to do it. It's not what I would prefer, but that's more of a stylistic thing. Structurally, though, that's fine. Notice you can connect more than one sentence with this comma and a conjunction. The paleontologists were stunned at their discovery. It meant that accepted theories were flawed. Again, I would use for here, and that would be a perfectly good way of connecting them. He needs to buy a new car. This is due to the huge fire. Again, I would probably not coordinate this normally. I would change this in other ways. Maybe make this because or make this due to. But if we wanted to keep the comma and the conjunction for whatever reason, I think and would work, no problem here. He needs to buy a new car, and this is due to the huge fire. Though, as I referenced briefly earlier, there might be an issue with this, and we'll talk about that in a later video. John put on his suit and tie. Then he grabbed his briefcase and closed the door. Again, I would add an end here. As you can see, and but, and I suppose for, at least for the purposes of these questions, are pretty common coordinating conjunctions. So in the next video, we're going to look at some other ways to put together two sentences.